So I'm going to give a case presentation now based on a client who I've worked with. It's not completely his story. Things have been changed around in order to protect client confidentiality. But I want to tell a bit of a clinical story of what it looks like being in the room and working with the system around a child who's experienced really complex chronic trauma and who comes to us with complex presentations. I'll call my client Omar. Here we go. So just briefly, I'll introduce Omar and I'll talk a little bit about his trauma experience and the context of working with both refugee trauma and developmental trauma, or the kind of complex presentations that we've been talking about. I'll then talk a bit about the different layers of my intervention, focusing mostly on the individual therapy, and then I'll finish by talking about the progress to date and future work. So this is not Omar, but this is just to create an image of a real person in our minds. As I said, all of the details have been changed. So Omar came to us at starts as a 7-year-old boy, but he appears much younger than that chronological age. He'd fled a war-torn country and experienced very chaotic early years. He was orphaned at a very young age and then raised by extended family members, being passed from family member to family member with no consistency, never staying in one place for very long. He's currently cared for by 2 very distant male relatives with 3 other boys in the house. I've done 6 group sessions with Omar and he calls them cousins, the other boys in his home, and I've done 10 individual therapy sessions. So I'm going to give a snapshot of that as we go. Omar was referred simultaneously, along with his cousins, by both his carer via his settlement caseworker and by his school shortly after his arrival. The concerns were different. His carer was concerned about fighting in the home with other boys. They were really struggling to maintain safety, and meltdowns, big emotional outbursts, particularly around difficulties with change. For example, when the breakfast menu was different to what Omar expected, he was completely unable to manage to get himself ready and get to school and face the day. School's concerns were a little bit different. They were worried that Omar seemed to have no understanding of safety or rules, refused to follow basic instructions and engaged in quite risky behaviour, for example, climbing really high and running away all the way out of the school grounds. He seemed unable to play with other children. He was extremely active, and it appeared that his attention and concentration difficulties were impacting his learning. So as you can see, there was a huge amount of anxiety in the care system around Omar, both at home and at school, due to his chaotic care history and his presenting behaviours. Just want to quickly highlight Omar's trauma experiences. So he had experienced profound relational trauma, loss, abandonment, and then there's continuing multiple rejections as he was passed from family member to family member. He'd lacked a secure base of consistent attachment figures from pretty much the very beginning of his life. We know that his parents both died when he's an infant. No one talks about them. He's never been told about anything about them in his family or about his immediate family from the extended network that have cared for him. It's like a big taboo, a black hole within the sort of care space. Instead, he was cared for by elderly grandparents for a very short time before they also passed away. And then, as I said, he's been passed from extended family member to extended family member. It's likely that he also experienced violence as well as emotional neglect. He's been exposed to prolonged war and social and political instability in his home country and had a very difficult and prolonged flight to finally reach safety in Australia. He's now under the care temporarily at this point in time with distant relatives in a home where there are 3 other boys who also have fairly high needs and big trauma histories. So within this context, he continues to lack the consistent attachment figures that we know is so important, both for healing from trauma and also for healthy emotional development. This is just to highlight that Omar doesn't know anything about his parents or his immediate family. As I said, it's like a big blank space at the centre of him in terms of his self-concept and his roots. So when I first met Omar, my initial impression of him, Omar arrived at our office for an introductory group. He grinned at me as he marched into the room. He picked up one of the sensory toys on the table and he began to stretch it as hard as he could. It was compact and strong with an air of a muscly toddler about him. He joined in slowly as he played Simon Says, copying my movements with confidence as he warmed up. Later, he broke away from the group and began to run in circles around and around the periphery of the room. And then just as suddenly, he plopped in a chair, head on desk, panting, and closed his eyes. I felt an immediate maternal warmth towards this fiercely energetic little boy. As has been highlighted by Roshan Coelho, refugee trauma exists in a complex interaction between state-sanctioned violence, torture, exile, forced displacement or migration, and settlement challenges. It takes place in the context of normal life challenges, the normal life cycle, and it's affected by both international and national events. As you can imagine from what we've already seen of Omar, this interaction plays out in his life and in his growth and in his development in a number of complex and dynamic ways. So normally when we're clinically treating or supporting a child with trauma, we're looking at strengthening the protective factors and reducing the impact of the stress factors. In the cases of developmental trauma, those protective factors might actually need to be built before they can be strengthened, particularly in a case like Omar's, when there's been a real lack of a secure base and secure attachment figures from the very beginning. Just quickly, I want to look at the risk factors and the protective factors that Omar brings. As I've already said, there was an ongoing war in his home country. He was experiencing ongoing relational deprivation, lack of safety at home, and no contact with his family, which impacts his sense of belonging and connection. However, he brings with him a number of protective factors, particularly his internal strengths, as I think was evident from my little snapshot of when I first met him. He was very energetic and there's something very charming around him. He's also very creative and outspoken. When I spoke to school, it was very obvious from the very beginning that not only did Omar elicit a lot of frustration from the adults around him, he also was able to elicit a real sense of warmth. And he was very well liked by other children. He also has a strong connection to his Islamic faith, which gives him an anchor and a blueprint for how to progress in the world. And it's a real source of comfort and strength and security and stability for Omar. Really quickly, talking about developmental trauma, trauma impacts the way that a child develops. It depends on the developmental stage that a child is at when they first experience the trauma. And then in a way, it's cumulative. So when we're looking and designing our intervention, we need to target the oldest area of impairment and work from the bottom up without forgetting about those other areas. So just quickly, I'm not going to go into all of this, but the different areas are in the brainstem, the somatic or the sensory, and then moving up into the limbic brain, relationship or attachment, emotional regulation and behaviour. And then finally in the cortical brain or the thinking areas of the brain, cognition and identity and self-esteem. And then the seventh area is disassociation, which sits across all of those. Okay, so moving on to my interventions. So I think it's clear from the picture that I've painted already that there were quite a few challenges that came along from the very beginning with thinking about where do I start with this little boy, and in fact this group of boys. They had no concept of counselling or mental health, partly due to their culture, but also due to their very young age. And of course, when we're working with a child, you can't ever assume that there is a therapeutic alliance or that it has been built and it's something that we constantly have to be recreating and engaging with throughout the work. So I knew that this was going to be a challenge on a number of levels with these little boys. The group dynamics and the competing needs of the children in the group were also quite a challenge to get our heads around where to start with this. And the language barrier was also really key. I knew it would be important, combination of language and attachment, to work with a consistent interpreter. So what I decided to do was to start with a short play-based arts group involving all 4 boys together to provide a bit of a soft entry into the therapeutic work to normalise the support by engaging them together and also drawing on the collective culture that they were from, and to create some engagement via a structured activity, fun, and from a stance of validation and providing lots of regulation opportunities. I hoped that this would provide an avenue to develop some safety with myself as a therapist, and that I would be able to start to assess the impact of trauma on those 7 domains that we just looked at. What was it about the approach that helped create safety for OMA? As I said, I used structured activities, fun, validation, and regulation. So, for example, I used a game of playing Simon Says, focusing on physical regulation and attunement, using my voice and body to signal safety, to invite participation and engage the boys' social engagement systems. Within this, using movement and attunement and rhythm to create some synchronicity of all of our nervous systems through this game, creating movements in a rhythmic way. Another example was some puppet play, asking the boys together to create a journey to safety. This created a space for the boys to literally play with some very exciting looking puppets with some big feelings. And this is also a way for them to use their body engaged in that play. What they did and what we saw was a collective, joint, projective, as in outside of themselves into the toys, expression of themes. The themes that came were aggression, power, victory, and celebration. And of course, what this was, it was a reenactment of their trauma story that they together could produce in a fun way and were able to find their own empowering ending, which is what the celebration was about. A key feature of this play, a key puppet, was a big bad wolf puppet, and this actually became an important motif in the later individual work with OMA. Observations of OMA within the group. I did 3 sessions in our office during the school holidays and then 3 sessions as the school year commenced at school. Omar kept his distance from the other boys and he gravitated more towards adults. There was something performative, a seductive kind of cheekiness about Omar, and I stayed curious about this and I started to wonder if this was part of a survival strategy that he had employed in order to be seen, to get his needs met. It was also really noticeable that he very quickly became frustrated and dysregulated. He withdrew into sympathetic fight at home, or in the room. It looked more like flight, running around and around the clinic room, and then he would flop when he flopped down on the table. Alongside the group work and the individual piece that I'll come to in a minute, the systemic containment, working with the system around OMA was really, really important. So case consultations with the school leadership and trying to build a relationship with his very stretched carers was really important, as was ad hoc checking in with his teachers and learning support, always coming from a perspective of supporting the professionals and carers around OMA in their relationship and their knowledge with the child, supporting their relationships and keeping my distance as a professional to support their confidence and the knowledge that they got from being at the direct interaction with him. Okay. So I'm going to try and whiz through this because I'm really conscious of the time. I'm going to look at 4 quick sections of my individual interventions. First, a little bit at the body, boundaries, touch on loss and longing, and if I have time, just touch on transference and countertransference at the end. So after those 6 sessions, I moved to individual therapy with OMA delivered at school. And I'm starting from a position of working with the body first, working from a perspective of me as the therapist being a psychobiological regulator. What do I mean by that? I mean regulation and attunement. Couple of examples, playing with the breath. So Omar was quite exuberant in the room. He spent a lot of time running around and jumping and killing the big bad wolf that I mentioned before. One time he flopped down on the beanbag, exhausted after all this running and jumping. I crouched down next to him and I mirrored his breath, slowing mine ever so slightly. His breath deepened into sync with mine. He grinned and closed his eyes and relaxed into the beanbag in a moment of quiet and calm, or what Stephen Porges would call rest and digest. Another example involves playing with proprioceptive pressure. This will be a controversial one because it involves touch. However, given Omar's young age and his developmental needs, purposeful, careful, and relational touch is appropriate in this context. Excuse me. So another time when Omar became overstimulated and he was getting quite restless and heightened, I crouched down before him, a little bit lower than him, and put my hands up and invited him to push against my hands, engaging in eye contact and encouraging him to see if he could push me over. He grinned and he pushed really hard, boring his eyes into mine. Engaging the upper body in deep proprioceptive input like this provided grounding, and it stabilizes the nervous system naturally, and it encourages it to stabilize itself. And in this situation, it gave Omar a sense of power and autonomy, which was so important for him, and a short, tolerable burst of relational connection through the gaze, which he'd been so missing throughout his development. Boundaries, always important in therapy, increasingly important and difficult when working with children with attachment trauma. Change and transitions inevitably activate anxiety within our attachment systems. So the transition from therapy back to the classroom became a real site of struggle for Omar, and he developed a bit of a ritual that I called the putty wars over him wanting to take his favourite putty back to the classroom. And this got played out week after week for about 6 weeks, where it became a real vehicle for Omar to express how much anxiety was activated for him by the transition back to class and his separation from me and that containing space. And for him to test how much I was able to take of him, of his rage, of his anxiety, of his need to be held in mind, and possibly also for his need for love. And on the counter, it became an opportunity for me to provide a positive relational experience, to be able to hold and think about and let go in that transitional space. It got easier and easier over the weeks for Omar to go back to class, until I was sick and I missed 2 weeks in a row. And after that, Omar erupted with a huge tantrum in the middle of the session, not even at the transition at the end. And it was about his favourite putty. It's a really, really difficult session, and I had to work really hard to keep myself regulated. I think there are 4 things that helped us to navigate this session. Firstly, staying regulated and present myself, anchoring my nervous system so that I could anchor his. Secondly, accepting Omar's rage without collapsing and sort of checking out or retaliating and becoming punitive. Thirdly, staying in the metaphor of the putty, receiving and thinking about his rage and returning it in tolerable amounts. So I made a clinical decision to not make a broader interpretation about the fact that he was so upset because I'd been away or I'd let him down, but to just focus on what he was expressing, what his rage was about, which was the putty. Because I felt, and it could be right, it could have been wrong, I felt that making a bigger interpretation would have been too pointy, too persecutory for Omar at that moment. It would have pushed him into further dysregulation. I think it helped, but it was a clinical risk that I took, and it could have been a missed opportunity. I think in this situation, it was containing and it was helpful. The other thing that I did was to use a transitional object to ease the separation. So I swapped the putty for some blue tack, allowing Omar to take the blue tack with him back to class. So giving him something concrete to help him feel held in mind, and also I think to help him hold me in mind as he went back out into the world. As Omar felt safer in the therapy, he started to play with feelings of love and grief and loss. 1 week, after weeks of violently defeating the big bad wolf, the wolf was completely gone or transformed. In his place was a mummy, a baby, and a daddy of the puppets. And in fact, the daddy was the wolf, but he wasn't a wolf anymore. Omar told me he was a protector and that he loved the baby. He had a big beanbag and he made it into a nest and climbed in. cuddling all three of the teddies, and he was completely engrossed. Suddenly he gave a loud sob and cried, "Oh, my poor baby, he's lost his mummy. She's died. They've all died." And he continued to play, really absorbed. They were wrapped and buried and cried for and sung for in really moving ritual. And then the most powerful boy in the world arrived, who was Omar himself, of course, and he brought the whole family back to life. At the end of this play, Omar grinned at me and told me that was a good story, in a way that I felt really demonstrated how aware he was that he was processing and playing with this longing that he had for having his own family. The main thing I want to highlight in terms of transference and countertransference when working with children with attachment trauma is how important it is for us to do our own work, basically, to have done it and to keep doing it, to know what's being elicited in us and to be able to work with it and hold it, to learn what can I learn from Omar through what is being elicited from me, but also to know what my vulnerabilities and my trigger points are going to be when sessions get really difficult and emotive. So skills in self-regulation as well as broader therapeutic techniques and loads and loads and loads of support, supervision, self-care can never be too much. Just really quickly, I know I've gone a bit over time, but I'll just whiz through. It's only been 10 sessions of individual work so far, but Omar is starting to be able to play with other children in the playground and participating a bit more in group activities in the classroom. At home, fights are less frequent and the relationship with the other boys is calmer. He's starting to develop some trust sometimes with carers and with the other boys. In therapy, I hope I've demonstrated that he's using the space and the relationship really well and is building some safety and trust. He increasingly uses me to support regulation. In fact, he comes up to me and holds his hands up and asks, "Will you please play with me?" That's just one example. He really enjoys having me be curious about his play and his mind, and he lets me know when I've got things wrong. And through the play, he's able to communicate and explore his internal world. He asks me to be involved and is starting to think with me afterwards about the stories that he's created. Future work will continue along the same path that we've been taking, providing experiences of co-regulation and building Omar's capacity to mentalise his own states and know what he needs to bring himself back to regulation. To play, literally through play with themes of loss and vulnerability as Omar brings them to the work, and to work with both the positive and negative aspects of the transference to facilitate Omar's awareness of his expectations in relationships, and within this, to support him to tolerate and think about vulnerability and love and the back and forth of the creation of experience and feelings and memories, particularly between him and me, that we will take with us when we inevitably say goodbye. That is it. Thank you very much.